off for a second.
I could pause it. Wait, let me see.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the inaugural episode of Teacher Talk with myself. My name is Russ Downey, with Dan Narlato of Doc Rocker Music, and our guest for today, Carson Bispels. Dan, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, what's up, everybody? So those of you that are following what's going on with Doc Rocker Music Academy, we've launched a Rock Talk podcast a couple weeks ago with myself and my cousin Jeff Bonomo. So we figured we're going to branch off, and why limit ourselves just to talking about rock music when we could talk about all sorts of stuff. We got a whole team full of teachers, one of whom is the lovely Mr. Carson Bispels, who's with us today. And we figured we came up with a lot of different topics we can kind of talk about, just from, the nature of doing this kind of work for the last couple of years, building this company. It's not even just my own thing. It's been a very collaborative effort with these three gentlemen that you see before you, as well as so many others that we can mention in the future that might even make some kind of guest appearance in the future, possibly. But we figured, this could be a cool little, while the Rock Talk thing is a little more kind of laid back and talks about just different kinds of rock music and genres and bands and, the overall scene of what's going on, we figured we'd do one that's a little more education focused, and especially even once the Rock Talk channel launched, we had a couple other teachers, like a bunch of guys I went to school with and stuff that reached out and we could talk a lot about teaching lessons to kids and different teaching experiences we've had. So we figured we'd put our heads together and we came up with a lot of different things we could talk about. So Russ, what are we talking about today?
So today we figured for the first episode, a really good topic to start off with that kind of encompasses the whole idea of what we're getting at. And what we want to talk about is the importance and the relevance of classical music in private lessons. So really big topic to start, but we're going to
it's a really good starting point for us because we could easily circle back to this several times and go into more detail. We have a couple different sort of little sub lists of different ways we can kind of get into this, and we could easily flesh those different subtopics out into their own episodes, and we possibly will in the future. So looking at our list here, the question is, how relevant is it? What's really the point of covering the greats in a modern private lesson situation, depending on the nature of why your student has gotten into taking lessons in the first place, what their immediate and long-term musical goals are, and figuring out, for example, speaking from my own personal experience, some of my students, I never touch classical ever. And we never even talk about Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, Chopin, and that's totally fine. And they have a great tenure with lessons with me, and they learn lots of different content, and then they move on and do bigger, better things. For other students, that becomes the reason they do sign up, because they want to play that stuff, and the integration of classical music into a lot of traditional teaching methods based on what instrument you're studying in the first place is a big factor. And then even for some of my students that get into classical much later on, and I know, Russ, you can agree with this 100%, of some of your students that take a year or two of lessons before we even get into classical, and then we want to sort of bridge that gap. And then we start, one of our questions is, what are some of the gateways into doing classical music in the first place? Let's say you've had a student who was already 2 or 3 years into their private lessons, and they've established a good mastery of the basics, and they're ready for something a little more advanced. So that might be a good place for us to start. And, Carson, at any point, if you have any, you could speak as a student and as a teacher, because we've had that dynamic for many years now. So that could be a lot of fun. Those of you that don't know, Carson's a bit younger than we are. Russ and I are grumpy old men that have been kind of doing this whole thing for a long time, and Carson's kind of new at it. Carson is going to Millersville currently and studying music education, and you're into what? You're finishing your first year, right?
I am actually in fall of my sophomore year right now.
Oh, right. I keep thinking we're still in summer mode here, because this whole pandemic has
But you mean it's not till March?
Yeah, right? You can ask any teacher. March has lasted 500 years, right?
It's 70 degrees outside. It's basically March. There's just
it's totally March. So Carson is starting his second year as a student studying music education, but that doesn't mean he really has a lack of experience. As long as I've known him, he's been a teacher on the private level, and not even just with one instrument. Carson is a really accomplished guitarist, but his main primary focus is drums. And
that's not true.
I'm not biased.
Really?
Yeah, my primary focus is guitar.
Well, wasn't it drums at first? I thought you were first a drummer.
Well, yeah, back in when I was growing up, third grade through freshman year of high school, but since then I really branched out, and my Yeah, my main instrument is guitar now.
Yeah, well, so I mean, guitar, like, but like, drums was the first thing you did, and
Yeah.
even while you were studying guitar, like with me, you were like doing drumline and stuff at school, and you're no slouch on the drum set. I've heard you play. You're awesome. So,
Thank you.
um,
Heard you
so
play some drumline stuff
we
before,
figured it would be
too.
really interesting to bring someone like Carson in for this particular episode because those are two of the instruments to which you would often find yourself the least exposed to classical music in the first place. Like I can sit here and talk about classical all day. I'm a classically trained concert pianist, but to hear what somebody who's not a pianist has to say about it, I think would be really interesting. So let's get into like, so maybe we could talk about our own personal experience of like first getting into classical music in the first place. What was our first exposure to it as a student or as a teacher? So Russ, why don't we start with you?
Sure. It took a long time for me to get into classical music, and part of it was because my first instrument was I was a drummer when I was growing up. I started at age 6 playing drums, and I didn't play piano until I was 14. So it took a long time to get into classical. So my first entrance into classical music beyond like hearing it in a general music class was basically in the piano books that I worked on. And so that was kind of my first entrance to it. And the part that I found kind of odd about it was the fact that at the time, in my teenage years, I was an avid Rush fan and still am, apparently. But the point is that at that time, it seemed kind of incongruous to be like, enjoying the classical stuff and be so much into like the progressive rock side of music, having grown up that way. And I found that it becomes really important from a technical standpoint, but it takes a lot to really start enjoying. Oddly enough, my gateway into enjoying classical music came from two sources. The first one was film soundtracks. And Danton knows exactly where I'm going with this because it's his favorite composer, and I'm going to put big air quotes around that, with John Williams. One of my favorite composers of all time. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but the music for me is what makes the movie. And to me, it's a great example of what classical has gifted the tradition of music in the form of programmatic music that winds up kind of illustrating what's on the screen, but also winds up kind of giving you a heads up as to like what you should be taking away from what you see in front of you. So for me, classical has always been one of those things where I never really had a huge deep dive into what you would consider traditional classical music until I became a teacher, or well, beforehand when I went to college for music ed. So it was an interesting thing because I find myself having to make up a lot of ground with the general knowledge of classical music beyond the basic stuff. And that's, now most of the time I use it to teach, but I still use those gateways of either classical music or video game soundtracks as a means to segue into teaching classical, because I find that there's a really steep, not learning curve, but a steep entrance, if you will, into starting to enjoy what you're listening to. It's a very fine line between it being really interesting to listen to because of how technically complex it is or how beautiful it is to listen to, and it being borderline boring for some students.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many kids my age quit piano like a couple of years in because like, oh, all we're doing is classical music out of the book, and I'm really not into that sort of stuff. I just want to learn to play more popular things, or I want to play whatever else that's not classical. And then, so many people just drop out and quit music entirely, which is why I always like to exercise a really friendly, like student centralized approach to teaching, where like, if that's not what you're into, that's not what we have to cover. We can find other ways to learn how to play all the major scales and learn all the different inversions of your chords. It all comes down to basic components that lend themselves well to any genre, not just classical. So, and that's definitely a real big hot topic for us, is that main gateway being film, TV, and video game music as a really good transition into that programmatic instrumental stuff that you get so often in classical. And for a modern era, that's, I would say it's safe to say that's true for a lot of non-musicians to like first hear like high scale symphonic writing is probably in a movie that you've seen, and probably hearing the soundtrack to that movie.
Even possibly in some animes too. I see a lot of students that kind of know music of that style from that type of medium.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I got one of my piano students right now is working on Sadness and Sorrow from Naruto, and it's this beautifully written like Chopin-esque piano piece, and it's beautiful, and that's what I love about the whole student centralized approach to teaching, is because I'm always getting exposed to this stuff that I never heard, and like, wow, this music is really fantastic, this is so cool. So yeah, it's definitely one of the big gateways, and we could easily sit here, all three of us can shed out for like an entire episode of like, let's talk about Star Wars music, or let's talk about The Legend of Zelda. I mean,
I'm okay with both of them.
when I was, I mean, those could easily be topics for episodes. I mean, I sat here my senior year as a composition major at Westchester University. I did my thesis on the music in The Legend of Zelda and how you can compare it to classical symphonic music. And it was a hit. You know, the professors loved it because they were like, wow, this music is in a video game? Really? Like, yeah, that's just why I like got into playing piano, is because video game music was awesome. You know, and anyone who knows me knows I'm a big video game music guy. It's how I even got into playing in the first place. So like really quickly, my own little background with classical was, I mean, I was brought up on a traditional piano method. I did the Bastian course for piano, which is a 4-level program, and it took me about 5 years to get through it. And there's little bits of nods to classical, like in the third book, there's like a sort of like beginner arrangement of Für Elise by Beethoven, but it's like super watered down, and it's a lot more pedagogically written. Like, it's like, here's a bunch of songs by the authors, James and Jane Smisler Bastian, husband and wife that like taught piano for years and years and years, and they wrote this method, and it's all like pieces they compose that are designed to teach you, here's how you play in B position, here's how you play in moving positions, here's how you play. It's what piano teachers call a multi-key approach, but more on piano pedagogy later. That's a whole other topic. But for me, like, my first early exposures to classical came after finishing that. My piano teacher put me on the John Thompson method, which is another sort of kind of traditional piano method that goes, I think there's 6 levels of it. So, and it's significantly more challenging and difficult. So it was the natural step forward. When I finished Bastian 4, he started me on Thompson 3. And what I first thought was like, well, is this like some kind of like downgrade? Thompson 3 was really, really difficult stuff. And it had a lot of like kind of watered down arrangements of like really famous classical pieces. Some of them were actual classical pieces. Like there was the famous Son of Bach solfeggetto, really famous piano piece, and it's like note for note there. And it's like, at the time it was like this super insane, challenging thing. And like and like at that point I was kind of getting exposed to a lot of different classical composers, but they were all like, like the whole book is like black and white, and it's like, here's like a stock like drawing or painting of them, and like this big long paragraph about their biography, and like so and so grew up in France and went to, you know, Prague and did this and that. And it's like, I really don't care. It really didn't grab my interest. Some of the music was interesting, and there were definitely a lot of really good arrangements in that book. And I look back on it now like, wow, this is a really awesome way to teach people when they're not like, you don't want to get like fully into like real classical stuff right away, because it's just so much more involved. And I'm kind of going back to it now thinking like, wow, it was really a good method for me as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old getting into this stuff, because it was manageable, you know. And there were opera excerpts in there. There were pieces from art songs. Like there's a piano solo arrangement of Stenchen by Schubert, which is really, really pretty, and it's really well done. And by the time I finished the end of Thompson 5, the last song in that book, well, not even song, it's a traditional piece. It's the first movement of Beethoven's F minor sonata, Opus 2, number 1. And it's like the whole thing is there, note for note. It's perfect. But like by the time I got to the end of level 5, I was getting ready for college applications. And like my first real deep dive into classical music, and classical being the giant umbrella from like late Renaissance, early Baroque, all the way through Romanticism in the 20th century, was in college. You know, I was not classically trained. I just went on these books, and then the rest of my piano lesson education as a high school kid was playing in rock bands. I was a rock musician, and I still am at my core. That's mainly what I do. But then, like, I really got into classical as a music ed major at Westchester, then turned into performance, and then that led to a whole more, like, really getting into the classical stuff. And that's, you know, so that's my story. What about you, Carson?
So for me, I have never really fully dived into classical music. Really, my only exposure to it is, well, initially, sort of kind of like what Russ was talking about with, like, film soundtracks, you know, like Star Wars, or I just smacked my mic in my face, like Star Wars right there.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuff really, like, I loved it, but I really didn't understand what classical really was until, like, you know, I like started getting into college, and like even like doing like concert band in like high school and stuff like that. And even then my knowledge is super, super limited because at my core, I am definitely more of a commercial musician. I like rock and roll, stuff like that.
Hmm.
But it's definitely something that I have been getting more exposed to, especially through college with my music ed degree. It's been awesome taking like piano classes, and even if like the pieces are super dumbed down, because like a lot of the people like in my class have never touched a piano before, like me.
Hmm.
But and then taking those pieces that we're learning and then like actually listening to like recordings of professional musicians like performing them, it's incredible, and it's been super eye-opening to me because it's a whole other world I never really experienced before until recent, and I think it's awesome.
Yeah, well, that's great, and that's exactly what us teachers love to hear. Is like after that long journey, when people finally come around, because there's a lot that classical music has to offer, and it's a shame that it sometimes gets brushed under the rug. And not to say that this is kind of like a soapbox we're going to try and defend classical, because classical has no place for some musicians, and that's
Yeah.
totally fine. If you want to do nothing but rock and that's totally your thing, fine, whatever. If you want to just do a hip hop and like learn making beats and just learning basics about chords, like I've had literally students in the past that have like taken piano lessons just because they want to get the bare basic tools to then start doing that whole genre, which is something I really know so little about. And it's like, all right, well then I'm not even, this guy doesn't care who Mozart is. This guy doesn't care about the difference from early to late romanticism, or conservative to progressive romanticism, or what makes the avant-garde movement special in the early 20th century. Like none of that has any relevance to a student that wants to learn music for that purpose. And that's a big part of what I love as a music teacher, is just how insanely diverse it is. I mean, when you're talking music lessons, it's literally anything. You can go in so many different directions with that. So, like I said, we could easily shed out an entire episode on like really talking about what some of the good gateways are, and as far as like multimedia film goes, or
I mean,
even
there was
as
one
far as
point.
like, yeah, go ahead.
That's cool. I think one point this really makes that's really important to keep in mind is that I think it kind of highlights how it's it's an age range type of thing when you start to really kind of get into it, because like to tell somebody who's a 12-year-old or 13-year-old like, okay, we're gonna sit down and we're gonna listen to like an entire Mozart symphony, they're gonna be like, okay,
Yeah,
fine.
Russ, you could speak firsthand as a public school teacher, doing that for like general music classes.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
probably had that experience before.
I did, and what I found is that like it's kind of tough. It's one of those things where I find the more complex the music, the older the age you have to be really start to be able to dive in and understand what's there. And you don't always need to have like some advanced musical theory knowledge to be able to actually appreciate what you're listening to. I mean,
Yeah.
probably to me, one of the greatest examples of classical music that does a really great job of not requiring you to have like an advanced, theory appreciation for it is something like Debussy's Clair de Lune. One of my
Yeah.
favorite pieces of his, because it's a beautiful piece of music. And the first time I heard it was on a Styx album. I'm not even kidding you. Dennis DeYoung, the keyboardist, basically used it as an intro to another tune. I'm like, that's really cool sounding. I wonder
I
what
never
that is.
knew
And I'm
that.
like, oh, that's this French composer that I've like never heard of. And then turns out, in high school, one of my marching band shows, we played the Sunken Cathedral during a marching band show. Go figure.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you told me
Yeah.
about that.
And the thing is that like it was really interesting to see that, but the fact that like it was used by somebody or an artist that I had listened to, that they had used that as part of what they put on their album, helped a lot. I think a lot of part of it is that there is a high barrier to entry for interest in classical. And Carson, you could probably talk to this as well, because like you said, you're just starting to get into it now, but it's a world that you probably wouldn't have given a lot of thought or interest to beforehand, because especially like given the fact that you were, that you're playing guitar and you were also playing drums as well. I went through the same kind of thing. It's not a thing you typically run for first thing. For piano players, for strings players, for even those who are in concert band, with the exception of saxophone players, unfortunately,
Yeah.
they don't really get a whole lot of entrance into that field. A lot of it comes through either your schooling, and either you really dig it or you don't, or usually that interest comes much later on. So it makes an important point is that like, as to the right time, I think it more depends on the age sometimes than anything else.
Yeah,
I
and
think that's
sort of
part of it.
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
But sort of piggyback on what you were saying earlier. So like you were talking about that Styx album that was using So I forget what
Claire
music
de Lune.
It was Claire de Lune. Yeah, the album was
Lune, yeah.
Crystal Ball. Mm-hmm.
So I can't think of any specifics, but I know I've definitely experienced like situations like that where I'll be listening to like a real like commercial tune, you know, like, and really just hear some like awesome like sort of like classical, not like sort of takes
Mm-hmm.
on older compositions and stuff, and I'm like, whoa, holy crap, that sounds really cool, but I have no idea what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, I can't tell you how
then-
many like famous jewelry commercials use like Vivaldi's Winter Season.
Oh, that's literally how I explain what that song is to students when I talk about Vivaldi. I'm like, you remember those Zales commercials from like, 10 years ago when all of you were 2 years old? Yeah, that was
here's the whole rest of what that whole like violin thing actually sounds, and it's like really, really dope. And you should check it out, and you should check out the rest of the seasons for that matter, because they're some of the best pieces ever composed. But that's just my opinion. But
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry.
and that's a whole other, kind of tying into the whole like using multimedia music, kind of going off of what Carson was saying of like, yeah, you could see like some of the similar writing practices in modern film music or video game music or like on TV shows. Think of like, like any famous like the Game of Thrones theme or something like that.
Mhm.
But then you're also talking about like, what about shows that actually use original classical music from days old? And the biggest example of that comes to mind for me is classic cartoons. Thinking like how many Looney Tunes episodes feature like excerpts out of Wagner operas or Beethoven
Helmet?
symphonies.
Yeah, Spear Magic Helmet. Yeah, you know how that one
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of it's pretty note for note true to the original material of the composers, because at that point all that stuff was recently rendered public domain, which means, for those of you who don't know public domain, if a composer has been deceased for 50 plus years, their music becomes free for anyone to use for any sort of commercial purpose without having to worry about needs of copywriting or anything like that. So a lot of the early cartoons of like the 20s and 30s were using this like recently rendered public domain stuff from the Romantic period of like, here's all these great recordings of famous symphonies and like these large scale symphonic works by like the late Romantic and early 20th century composers.
I mean, the first time
that
I ever
also
heard-
led into like the early, like all like the first commercial days of like the 50s and 60s, and like once television comes out, and like the same idea, because all this stuff is public domain, you could freely use an excerpt out of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony for your commercial about car insurance, and no one's gonna bat an eye, so like that sort of thing, and renders in like a lot of kids, like even in our older generation, there's a bit of a gap between us and our friend Carson here, but like we're all kind of in that same boat of like a lot of our earliest exposures to classical music comes from like hearing some random, like I know I was watching some like home movie about the Philly Fanatic, and it like uses the first movement of Spring, and it's like this goofy scene. He's like going into like some kind of library, and he's like sticking his tongue out at the librarian and like doing all this dumb stuff, and it's playing, and like I'm like, oh, and then I actually heard that piece proper later on. I'm like, I heard this before somewhere. Where have I heard this? And I was like, oh yeah, it was on some random TV thing. It was on some random commercial. It was on some random cartoon, and like all that stuff was free to use. So like a lot of us got subconsciously exposed to it, and which is really interesting when you then grow into being a mature musician, going to study it professionally, and then you're looking at all this music under a more critical lens, and you're like, why would they use that for this? That's so weird.
It was free. It's free. It's
And
like-
that's the end all be all reason. It was all they had to really work with, and it was like a quick, easy way to like throw music into your product. And
I mean,
it's
the one
almost
thing
a
that I-
service, I would say, to the composers of old, of like how they really kind of esteemed their music as serving a greater purpose. And like, can you imagine like what Mozart would think if like Symphony 40, like he sees it on like a commercial for like something completely stupid, like I sometimes kind of lay awake and ponder that and think like, what would these composers say if they found out their music was being used for something so radically far off what they originally intended? So I don't know if they'd find it interesting or offensive. Go ahead.
Well, the funny part is that like talking about that, one of the first times I ever heard like the Barber Seville, you know exactly what I'm going to talk about here.
Oh yeah, we have a shared
Exact-
experience with
Yeah,
that.
the exact Looney Tunes one where you got Bugs Bunny over there, welcome to my shop. Let me cut your mop. Let me shave your crop. Daintily. I mean, it's that kind of stuff is a great example of it. Now, the unfortunate part is Carson. I know that probably missed your generation by about 10 years because they decided to like get rid of Looney Tunes as a thing on TV when.
Oh yeah, that's a whole different
Yeah,
topic.
But
it
the thing
wasn't
is that like
quite the
that had-
same.
but that as an example is kind of interesting because you wind up having this weird kind of situation where you know the song but you don't know the title or the composer. It's kind of like if you've ever heard a song on the radio, you're like, I know the song but I have no idea who this is, and if somebody asked me what the song was, I couldn't tell them. So it's a weird situation.
If I
But
had
you
a
know,
dollar.
but the funny part is that like that actually makes a really good example. Even kind of going back to what Carson was saying as well, it's really interesting to hear like um, stuff that's inspired by that by those who are, I guess, as you could put them, commercial musicians, those who are rock bands, those who are
Yeah.
jazz musicians. I
A
mean,
lot more popularly accessible, right?
it's interesting to find because you wind up seeing a group of musicians who are inspired, who like learn, not maybe not inspired, but learned in this style, creating a music not of that style, but borrowing elements of it. Like for example, Dan, you could talk about this, but I also want to ask Carson about this too. Um, think for example, a musician like Rick Wakeman, who you can tell was a classically trained musician, but played rock music throughout his entire career. Some of it more on the nose that it was classical inspired, like you know, all of Six Flags of Henry VIII, or half of his stuff with Yes. But then you wind up having you know, groups like Genesis, who they have an entire album of Selling England by the Pound, where you wind up having stuff that sounds like it was written by, you know, your standard English composers, like your, you know, like Elgar or Ray Vaughan Williams. And, you know, it kind of has this inherent Englishness to it. You know what I mean? I mean, it just like that general kind of feel to it. I mean, like Carson, I'm sure you know, come across that kind of stuff for guitar where like the work is definitely more classically guitar inspired rather than being more riff based. It's a totally different mindset.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of talking about that, I think there's, at least from what I've noticed with people and my peers that I've interacted with, is there's such a stigma, I think, at least, against classical music. Like, it's interpreted in such a way where it's sort of like, it's for like the smart kids who are like better than everybody else, you know, and all that. But what people don't realize is almost everybody, at least in America and like just in general, have been exposed to classical and have enjoyed it. They just don't realize that they did, like you were talking about with like Looney Tunes and stuff like that and all of that. And I just find that really like fascinating. And I think that, yeah, just the stigma mainly is the thing that's really driving people away from it and sort of keeping people from really exploring it. Because classical still exists. It's just in an entirely different form than it originally was.
No, you're exactly right. You've got the exact point. Like, more people have been exposed to classical music than they realize. I think the problem there is that there is, and you know, Dan and I can both speak to this, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well from your experience now in, you know, College of Music Ed. There's a stigma, but there's also there's an air of arrogance sometimes that surrounds it.
Yeah,
Whereas like
the music I listen to is so much more sophisticated and complex than your petty little pop jams. So
Right.
gone peasants. So while I listen to this Mozart Symphony Number 13,
and the kicker is that like, you know, you could listen to something in that sense, like classical symphony, and in terms of complexity, I'd put that up against like any jazz album from the early 60s and, you know, dare them to say this isn't more complex than this, because some of the actual harmonic language, the rhythmic, you know, like the rhythmic style of what they're playing,
layering, textures, all that
exactly
stuff.
the textures. It's so different, but equally yet complex. I mean, I find the same. This is one of the reasons I enjoy prog rock so much, is that like it takes the concepts of writing in rock style, but puts it into the form of symphonic music. Especially some of your great long concept album tunes, like your 2112s. Supper's Ready by Genesis, Close to the Edge by Yes. You know, all those tunes are like 20 minutes long with like 7 different parts that look like they were written for a symphony to play. And the thing is that for somebody to say this is less valid than this Mozart symphony, than this, you know, this Haydn symphony, then, you know, you understand what I mean. It puts a bad taste in your mouth.
Yeah, it could be a little frustrating for music consumers too.
I mean, you know, it's something that I think is doing it a disservice, where I think it would be a lot better to try and steer away from having that air of arrogance about it to help bring more people into it. I think you'd find more people would enjoy it if it didn't have this kind of stigma about it. I mean, like, you know, we have, you know, plenty of examples we come up with. I know there's, you know, quite a good bit for rock. There's some for jazz as well. I mean, you even had like, you know, Duke Ellington basically taking Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy and turn that into a jazz tune. And yeah, it's interesting because you wouldn't think jazz and classical fit together, but they can. It's an interesting,
especially given Tchaikovsky's harmonic language. Are you kidding? You could probably do more, that same adaptation with so many more of his pieces than just his well-known stuff out of the Nutcracker.
Oh, easily. And there again, when you listen to his music, you know, it doesn't have that same kind of, I hate to use the term stuck up, but it doesn't have that same feeling that you might get from like a Baroque era piece. Like myself personally, I'm not a big fan of the Baroque era music with a few exceptions, because it just feels like it's very kind of, it basically, I don't know how to put it. It's very kind of stuck up sounding. It very much buys into its own.
I think that ties right back into its more commercial uses of modern times, because a lot of times Baroque music, like you look at any sort of like Handel Concerto Grosso with harpsichord and like continuo and all that stuff, it's always used in a setting of like a movie where it's like, here's like this like rich family that's like doing this big party, and they're like, they have this air of superiority, and they're using Baroque music to signify that. I can think of a really, really obscure but specific example in the form of Super Mario RPG, which is it's a soundtrack rife with a lot of nods to classical, because the composer who wrote for that, Yoko Shimomura, was a classically trained conservatory piano performance major. And she was a big fan of Tchaikovsky, and she actually rearranges a whole bunch of Tchaikovsky tunes to be used in the game soundtrack, which is fantastic. For those of you that have never like played the game or even heard of the soundtrack, just go on YouTube and listen to it. You don't even have to know a thing about what the game is like or what it looks like or what it's about or the story. Just listen to the music. It's fantastic. But she has like, there's this one particular character that makes an appearance late game, and Shimomura composes like this 3-part like Baroque style 18th century counterpoint fugue for harpsichord, and it's like meant to, it's literally designed, it's written, it sounds like something right out of a Bach partita. And like note for note you can pick it apart, and it fits all the proper harmonic conventions and like developments and whatnot, and the way we can sit here and talk about it, but it's literally, it's written for the sole purpose of projecting that kind of haughtiness and like superiority of like this character who like walks around like fanning herself and pretending that she's better than everybody else. And that's a really, to me, that's a real crying shame, because I was not really big into Baroque music either. Like when I first got into studying classical, it was like, oh, it's all notes and no music. And wow, I could not be more wrong saying that, you know, because like now Baroque is one of my favorite sort of things to go back to. Like I actively go back and listen to Bach now. And I'm not trying to say that like, oh, look at me, I listen to Bach, but because I've now learned to like really appreciate it after so many years of studying other stuff and coming back to it. It's like, wow, there's really a lot here that is, it's such a shame that it gets kind of dusted off as like, oh, you only listen to that if you're like super sophisticated. And like, that's really, it does that a whole time period. It's such a tremendous disservice, I think.
Oh yeah. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I wasn't crazy about it to begin with, is that like, it has that kind of sound to it, and it's used that way. Now, after, you know, becoming a music teacher and, you know, kind of getting a better appreciation for it, I do find myself enjoying it more than what I used to when I was younger. But had I not had that training and, you know, learned about a lot of that, I'm not sure if I necessarily would have gained that appreciation for something like that.
Yeah, and that's really, really unfortunate, I would say. So yeah, at this point, we're pretty much running out of time, guys. But this definitely, I think this opens up a lot of different topics we can further explore in the future, you know, and I hope it, to anyone listening in, after we, you know, post this and air it or whatever, and, you know, when people tune in and check it out, hopefully it opens you all up, you know, especially all you non-classical musicians out there, to like maybe kind of take a step back and look at some of this stuff and sort of maybe exercise more of an open eye to learning to appreciate it for what it really is, and seeing some of the, you know, there's literally hundreds of years of great music out there that's either not getting consumed or getting consumed under the wrong contexts or getting consumed for the wrong reasons. And, you know, I think this is definitely a real hot topic we can kind of circle back on. We're probably going to come back to this many times throughout the creation of this future podcast. So this is our, as Russ mentioned, our, you know, what was the word you used? Our inaugural, like, first episode.
Yep. Our inaugural episode, and boy,
our inaugural episode, you know, and it's way
started off with a whammy.
Yeah, so hopefully it raises a lot of questions, and that's kind of the point of this. The whole thing is supposed to be it's a dialogue, it's a discussion. It's eventually we're gonna definitely do some really informative ones in the future of like, well, let's talk about different pedagogical practices for aspiring teachers out there. I know I've done a lot of that sort of stuff in my little like daily vlogs on my Instagram channel for the Doc Rocker School. So like more stuff like that is going to come in the future, but I think we're going to have a lot of really fun sessions like this where like it just kind of we want to make teachers think, you know, especially like you get kind of set in your ways, you get trained to do a certain thing a certain way. And I think a part of what we're doing here is we want to sort of challenge that and get teachers to kind of at least think more critically and reflect on what they're teaching and how they're teaching it. And yeah, there's definitely more to come. So until then, you know, tune in next time for another episode of Teacher Talk, you know, and we're going to have, you know, myself and Russell are going to be here for pretty much every episode, but we're going to get our boy Carson here for a few of them. We're going to hopefully feature other teachers as well. I know there's a couple of my own Facebook friends, like I said, colleagues I went to school with that are possibly interested in making an appearance. So we're going to draft out a content calendar and keep your eyes posted on all the Doc Rocker platforms. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. There might be a Twitch coming in the future. So stay tuned for details. And I'm going to be posting a lot about not just Rock Talk, but also this new Teacher Talk channel. And until then, my name is Danton Arlotto. I teach for Doc Rocker Music, and our host, Russ Downey, and our guest, Carson Bespels. You know, we wish you all the best and enjoy the rest of your time. And we will see you next time. All right. See ya.
We'll see ya.